my wife Jen is a nurse, and a couple years ago at work, someone asked her if she'd be willing to take on an extra shift next week, and she said, let me check with Bobby, and then I'll get back to you. And the woman was aghast. She said, what? You have to ask for your husband's permission? So we're going to talk a little bit today about how to honor each other, and specifically some of these gender issues are addressed in chapter 11. This is something that culture is pretty sensitive on, and we've come a long way in culture around these things. And we're so far removed from some of the customs that happen in the Middle East, so I need to kind of reel it back a little bit to explain some of those things. I was so convicted before the sermon, I actually went and had my hair cut because I'm like, man, I got to get this right. I'm just kidding. We're just going to kind of try to discern what is behind the veil of some of these cultural things. What is God trying to unpack for us? And I really believe the simple idea today is that it's important for us to honor each other, right? We want to be honoring. And so what does that look like today in our culture? So let's go to chapter 11, and we'll start in verse 2, where Paul is writing to these believers in the city of Corinth. I commend you. You remember me in everything and maintain the traditions as I've delivered them to you. His first words are a commendation. You guys have been honoring to me. I've been an apostle who founded the church. I've been asked by God to sort of lay the foundation for the church. You guys have been listening to the Greek word traditions is the teachings as delivered, and I commend you for that. And now Paul in verse 3 is going to dive into a question that he is answering around when they assemble together. It's not working out so well. It's kind of dishonoring towards each other when you meet together. And so he's going to address some of that. I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. So in the context of this, in the Roman Empire, the local church was this beautiful change from what people had been experiencing. People had been very oppressed in the Roman Empire. And when it came to church, all of a sudden, they would be able to come, and there was no division by socioeconomics, right? You could be very wealthy in the church and very poor, and you're just as one. You could come from all different races, and you would be accepted as one. Whether you're male or female, it didn't matter. You were one. And so it was a beautiful thing. They were able to celebrate that. So they came together, and they're praying and prophesying in this room. And all of a sudden, it started to feel uncomfortable culturally because some of the women had taken off their head coverings, and they were just freely praying and prophesying. And so they were kind of asking Paul, how do we address some of these things? It doesn't feel quite right in this context. So Paul actually starts out with the underlying principle of what does headship even mean in the Bible? And we'll talk about that. And then how do we interpret that into culture today? So verse 3, actually, the idea of headship, you have the idea of God, Jesus, husband, wife, and you have this headship that's listed where we're trying to understand what does it actually mean. And when we understand the way Jesus honored the headship of his Father, it helps us to understand the word headship and that it means authority, right? The authority. So the way Jesus operated is he would say, Father, not my will, but your will be done. That Jesus emptied himself willingly, it was his choice, and he became obedient to death, even on a cross. And then God highly exalted him and gave him the name that was above every name. So you see something around Jesus, the way he would honor the headship of his Father. And as he went along, he would be looking to the Father to say, basically, God, may your will be done in this, right? And so then Paul brings in the example of a husband and wife. And it mirrors what he says in Ephesians chapter 5 about headship, and that the husband has to be the one who's held responsible in the end. The question of headship is really the question, when it comes down to it, who's really in charge, or who has to give a final account for what's happening here. And so that's in order to avoid chaos or total anarchy. there has to be some sort of a line of authority, right? So it's not a question of who's better or for worse, because we know that when Jesus was questioned, it was I and my Father are one. We know within marriage that there's oneness. So we know that the Bible actually teaches headship and partnership. They both are linked together. But again, in order to avoid chaos, there's always got to be a line of authority. In other words, everybody's under some sort of authority. I'm under the authority of the elder board here at CFC. The elder board's under the authority of our district superintendent in Harrisburg. He's under the authority of our president in Columbus, Ohio, of our denomination, and so on. So people are under different levels of authority. There's a line of authority. But I think it's interesting that he doesn't just remind us of authority in here, but then in verse 11, he says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman, for as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. It's like, don't forget your mother, guys. I gave birth to you. So we not only have the teaching of headship in the Bible, but then it is elaborated and linked together with this idea of partnership, that husband and wife are really interdependent. It's funny to me that Adam in the garden, when God had created him, he gets to have this perfect world in the garden, and he also gets to enjoy walking with God in the garden, like direct access to God. And God looks at Adam and says, dude, you are incomplete. Like even in the perfect world with direct access to God, you're still not finished. And so he completes him by creating Eve. And then he gives this imagery that they're actually in a partnership. So they're really one. They're one together. For Jen and I, the way this will work is we like to be together on our decisions, and we like to give clarity. You decide in this area, you in this area, and then when we're working things out together, we like to be on the same page. And that's basically the way we've operated. I think there was once when we were trying to decide on buying a car where she just was like not sure, and she's like, you just decide, right? But we like to be on the same page. In order to avoid anarchy or chaos, somebody has to make a final decision. And so that's how God has designed it here. I just want to talk briefly about this phrase, the head. The head of a wife is her husband. In Genesis 2, then the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and to keep it. So that word shamar in the Hebrew is to guard it, or to protect it, or to watch over it, right? And so just imagine when Eve was in the garden and all of a sudden the serpent comes. When the garden was faced with a threat, Adam did nothing. When Eve was under spiritual attack, Adam did nothing. When Eve was offered fruit, Adam took the path of least resistance. When God came to speak to him, he hid. And when God confronted him, he blamed Eve. So Eve actually took of the fruit and ate it. And then she gave it to Adam, and then he ate it. And who is held responsible for the fall? It's Adam. He's the one who's held responsible for the fall of mankind. In Genesis 3, one of the results of the curse is to Eve, it is your desire will be contrary to your husband, but he will rule over you. Have any of you had an easy marriage? So built into marriage and into the curse is this idea that we're going to struggle along the way. Adam was passive, and he passed that down to other men. So we as men can tend to be passive. So here's Eve, and she has to live with a loser. How's that feel, ladies? You have to live with a passive loser. That's the default. So that's why the Bible says to respect your husband and to do it as unto God, because it's pretty hard to be respectful sometimes of someone who has inherited these tendencies from Adam, right? And so that's just part of the story in here is the fall. And the only one who really redeems this is Jesus on the cross. When you imagine what Jesus did on the cross, paying the biggest sacrifice as the encourager and to present her complete. And the bride, the church of Christ, in nonstop honor, willing to follow Jesus and pleased to do that. So it's Jesus on the cross that redeems this imagery. And that's why the world and our culture cannot fathom the idea of the role of husband and wife in the Bible, because they don't know Christ. They don't know what Jesus has done and how Jesus, when it works properly, will transform men into being able to be active as Christ, sacrificial, to guard and protect, and to emulate the sacrificial love of Christ on the cross. So when we know Jesus, it will help to redeem God's design. So Paul in verse 3 kind of lays out the design or the biblical background of headship and of partnership. And then he goes into more of the cultural context of what it looks like to honor. So in verse 4, he's talking about men should not cover their heads. Ladies should cover their heads in this context. And then some of the reasoning is that it's disgraceful in that culture for a woman not to cover her head. For men, it can be associated with a lack of respect and even prostitution in that culture. Secondly, the man, he is the image and glory of God in verse 7. And so it's a glorious thing to see a strong man willing to be in submission to Jesus Christ. For a man in his strength to bow before God and be in submission. And then it says that woman is the glory of man, and it's something powerful for the beauty of a woman to be willing to be respectful of the role of the husband and to submit to that. And then it says that woman in verse 8 and 9 was made from man and for man. So then in that culture, they have the head covering as a symbol of authority. And in some churches, they even take this literally and still ask for ladies to wear a head covering. We don't believe here at CFC that is culturally where we're at today. And so the fourth reason in this is just for the sake of the honor of angels. All right, so because of the angels. Now, what is that talking about? Because of the angels. So we have in this passage an interesting thought about the idea that angels were there in God's original design of creation. They were there when 1/3 of the angels fell and went into a rebellion. And then angels are present in our public worship. Angels are here in the room as we worship. And they're here when we pray. They're ministering agents for you. Angels are there to help us and to support us. And as they're observing, they love to see God's design fulfilled when it comes to honoring each other. So that's the idea of honor. And then verse 13, Paul just goes into this idea. You judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered and so on? He asks people to judge in verse 16, not to be contentious. So I want to take a few minutes just to say, let's discern or let's judge for ourselves and kind of unfocus and not get stuck on just the idea of head coverings, because anybody can do things on the outward, right? And adjust to things on the outward. But what does it look like to actually honor each other today? So for a husband to take on the role of Christ, to be sacrificial in his love, and to be willing to take the high ground, to guard and protect the home, not to be easily offended, and to be willing to honor his wife and his family in that way. And then for a wife, what does it look like to be honoring and respectful of the role of a husband? It can be easy as husband and wife just to separate out and say, well, you do you. You do you. We'll each have our own bank account, our own budgets, our own time, and you do you. And it doesn't reflect God's design for partnership in marriage and to be able to be honoring with each other. If you liked what you heard, you can check out the full sermon by clicking on the video right over here. And if you want to connect with us, you can do so on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram. Thank you for watching today. God bless you.